Today's case is one of those stories that sounds more like a movie than real life once you hear the details. One morning in November 2004, a court clerk named Peter Porco stumbled out of bed and went about his normal morning routine. As he picked up the newspaper and ate his breakfast, he seemed to be completely unaware that he had been attacked savagely just a few hours earlier, and his wife Joan was still in bed upstairs, clinging to life. Peter had almost gotten ready to the point of leaving for work. It wasn't until his co-workers began to worry, as Peter did not show up for work, that the gruesome scene inside the Porco home was revealed. Peter, now dead, while his wife Joan was upstairs, barely alive. Both had been hit in the head multiple times with an axe. Before Joan was rushed to the hospital, a detective was able to question her and get the name of the suspect: Christopher Porco, the couple's 21-year-old son. Soon enough, the investigation began to reveal disturbing details of Christopher's life and the insidious web of lies that he had weaved to take advantage of his own parents. However, when the only witness to the crime, Joan, woke up from a coma, she changed her story. According to her, Christopher was innocent. But in the end, was this mother's love enough to save her son from conviction?
Discretion is advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. Thanks for joining today. I'm Joe, and what has it been, like 2 years since the pandemic started? And not long after that, I decided to start doing this podcast. If you're like me, it's been a couple of years of being stressed, blessed, a little bit depressed. But I think we're doing okay as a whole, right? Hopefully. Okay, so before we get going to the story today, make sure you're subscribed to 10-Minute Murder. In the show notes, you'll find a bunch of links to where you can connect with me and this podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, places like that. If you do connect, you'll always know when new episodes are out because I'll give you a heads up on there. Now, to today's story. Peter and Joan Porco were a model example of a middle-aged, middle-class American couple. By November 2004, they had been together more than 30 years, had 2 sons, Christopher and Jonathan, and had lived comfortably in a 2-story home in Del Mar, New York. Peter worked as a state appellate division court clerk, and Joan was a children's speech pathologist. On the morning of November 15th, Peter got up like every day. He used the bathroom and got dressed before heading to the kitchen to make breakfast. Afterward, Peter loaded the dishwasher and packed his lunch for work. But for some reason, Peter never arrived at the courthouse. According to those close to him, Peter was a very responsible, very reliable person. So when he didn't show up for a trial, coworkers requested court police to go check on him. It was too out of character for Peter to just not show up, especially without calling. Immediately upon entering the Porco residence at 36 Broccoli Drive at 11:35 a.m., the New York State Court officer Michael Hart discovered Peter lying dead in a pool of blood. Before going any further, Officer Hart called for backup. Once police and paramedics arrived at the scene, the rest of the house was investigated. What they found looked like it was straight out of a gory horror movie. It appeared that Peter had stumbled out of bed and carried about his normal morning routine, all while being seriously injured. His blood was in the kitchen, on the walls, in the doorways, in the bathroom, and of course, in the master bedroom, where there, lying on the bed, first responders found Peter's wife, 54-year-old Joan, whose head was fractured in several places, her jaw was crushed, and her left eye was completely missing. But somehow, she was still breathing. Next to Joan, under the blanket, was a large firefighter's axe. Before Joan was rushed to the hospital, Detective Christopher Bodish asked if she knew who did this to her and her husband. Unable to speak, Joan just nodded her head. Detective Bodish then asked if a family member was responsible, and again, Joan nodded. Next, he asked if it was the oldest son, Jonathan, but she shook her head. And finally, Detective Bodish asked if the assailant was 21-year-old Christopher, to which Joan nodded twice. After confirming her younger son was the one behind the attack, Joan was transported to the hospital, where she underwent several operations on her face and skull. Meanwhile, the Albany County Medical Examiner performed an autopsy on Peter. They counted 16 wounds in his head, all of them caused by an axe. Nobody knows how on earth Peter had been able to get up from bed in the morning and almost leave for work before he finally died from his horrible injuries. There must have been so much adrenaline in his system that he was completely unaware of what had happened to him and Joan. Peter had not even reacted to the enormous amount of blood all over the house. He had basically been a zombie, walking around, going through his morning routine. The attack had been so brutal, it was difficult to come up with a reason why the Porco's own son would have done this to him. The Bethlehem police began looking into Christopher Porco's past, trying to find a possible motive. In the process, the couple's other son, Jonathan, was ruled out as a potential suspect in the case because he was serving in the military and had an alibi that placed him many miles away from his parents' house at the time of the attack. Christopher, however, well, you could say that there was a lot going on with him. His classmates at the University of Rochester reported that Christopher was a heavy drinker, had reportedly threatened to kill a female student, and had to be pulled off of another person during a fight at a party because he wouldn't stop choking them. Also, Christopher portrayed himself to his schoolmates as a jet-setting millionaire, when in reality, he was deeply involved in internet gambling, and a lavish spending cycle earned him more than $40,000 in debt. Christopher had a history of stealing money from his parents and opening up lines of credit without their knowledge. Christopher had even faked 2 burglaries at his parents' house 2 years before Peter's murder. Stolen items, including Joan's laptop, had later turned up, sold on eBay to a man in San Diego. And who was the seller? Christopher Porco. A vet clinic where Christopher was working in June 2003 was burglarized, and a cell phone, a camera, and computers were taken from that burglary. There's an obvious pattern here. As a cherry on top of the cake, Christopher was expelled for poor academic performance in the fall of 2003. After that, he forged a transcript from the college showing that he was a straight-A student to try to trick his parents. Christopher also said that he was reapplying to the University of Rochester and needed a co-signer for a $2,000 loan for tuition. In reality, he had other plans for that money. Finally, in November 2004, Peter and Joan found out the extent of their son's lies and how much he was taking advantage of them. Peter ran a credit check on himself one day, and to his surprise, he discovered a $31,000 loan as well as a $16,000 loan. The funny thing is, Peter had never signed for either one of those. Instead, Christopher had forged his father's name and purchased a yellow Jeep Wrangler. Obviously, Peter was big mad. He threatened legal action against his son, writing him an email saying, quote, "I want you to know that if you abuse my credit again, I will be forced to file forgery affidavits in order to disclaim liability, and that applies to the Citibank college loan if you attempt to reactivate it or use my credit to obtain any other loan." It's pretty clear that was definitely the right thing to do in a situation like this, but it seems like cutting their son off may have cost Peter and Joan Porco. Less than 2 weeks after that email, they were attacked with an axe. When police questioned Christopher about his whereabouts the night of the murder, he said he was at school the whole night, which was not the case. Investigators got their hands on surveillance video that showed Christopher leaving school in his bright yellow Jeep Wrangler. His DNA was even found later on a toll ticket. The route to his parents' house requires passing through 2 toll stations. As if that was not enough, the police also knew that the Porco's alarm system had been disarmed the night of the murder with the master code. In addition to Peter and Joan, who else would have the code? Obviously their own son. In a weird turn of events, in December 2005, Joan, who had implicated her own son as the attacker, now said she has no memory of the attack and that she believed her son was innocent. Joan even noted that the police should, quote, "go after the real killers." However, as the other evidence pointed directly at Christopher, he was eventually arrested and charged for the murder of his father and attempted murder of his mother. The trial started in July of 2006. The trial was held in Goshen, Orange County because of intense media coverage in the Albany area. The prosecution described Christopher as a sociopath who murdered his parents because they caught him lying and because he would have inherited enough money to pay his debts. As Assistant DA Michael McDermott said during the opening statements, quote, Christopher Porco went home on the morning of November 14th to silence the voices that wanted to hold him accountable. While it seemed that the attack of the Porcos was an open and shut case, there were still some obstacles for the prosecution. For starters, 2 lead detectives on the case, including Bodish, who interviewed Joan, unexpectedly died over the past year. The investigators had also not found any bloodstains inside Christopher's Jeep or his fingerprints in the house. And of course, there was Joan standing behind her son, believing Christopher was innocent. But in the end, his mother's support was not enough to save Christopher, who was found guilty of second-degree murder and attempted murder on August 10, 2006. 3 months later, the judge sentenced Christopher Porco to 50 years to life. Following the verdict, prosecutor David Rossi was quoted saying, "Chris thinks he's smarter than everybody else. He thought he was smarter than everybody else that night. He thought he committed the perfect crime. He didn't." Today, Christopher Porco remains incarcerated at the Clinton Correctional Facility in New York. He will be eligible for parole in 2052. In 2013, he sued Lifetime in order to block the release of a movie called Romeo Killer, the Chris Porco story. Christopher reasoned that the film is fictionalized, which is a pretty rich argument from a man that lived his whole adult life in a lie. That's 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. Thanks for being a part of it today, and if you enjoyed listening to the story and think maybe you have friends that would too, please let them know about 10-Minute Murder. Also connect with me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, all the places. Links are in the show notes of this episode. And obviously subscribe to 10-Minute Murder to make sure you don't miss any future episodes if you have not already done that. Thanks for listening. Be safe and have a good night.